I am Lynn Wilson, and as Mark had mentioned, I've done several of the webinars. And just, a little bit about myself. I actually live in Oklahoma. I'm a member of Cherokee Nation, and I have been providing small business technical assistance and services to all different types of small businesses for about the past 13 to 14 years. The break-even analysis is definitely one of those things, whenever I sat down with a new client that wanted to start a business, this is definitely one of the first steps that we would always go through. So I think you're going to find the information really helpful. So just a few things that we're going to cover during this webinar is I'm going to teach you the usefulness of the break-even analysis, so how it's going to be able to be useful to you whenever you're starting a business or even if you have an existing business, on how that's going to help you expand. And I'm also going to show you how to calculate your break-even in several different ways, both in units and sales and for desired profit. Now, there's a few terms that I want to go over because these are terms that I'm going to be using a lot throughout the presentation. And so the first term, obviously, is break-even itself. And break-even is simply the point at which you're not losing any money, but you're also not making a profit either. And fixed costs. Now, fixed costs are expenses that they don't vary with sales volume. So it doesn't matter how much you sell, these costs are always going to pretty much remain the same. And they're going to be paid regardless of whether you sell one item or 1,000 items. And a fixed cost, you may also hear that it's often referred to as an overhead cost. So something like rent would be a fixed cost. Then we have variable costs, and those costs are costs that fluctuate directly with sales volume. So the more you sell, the higher the cost is going to be. And we'll do an example later on using a hamburger example, but that's a good example. So obviously, variable cost would be like your hamburger buns and your hamburger meat. So the more of those that you sell, the higher that cost is going to be. So that's a variable cost. And then we have your unit selling price, and that's exactly what it sounds like. It's the retail price that you are selling your product or service for. And then finally, we have contribution margin per unit. And so the contribution margin is the selling price minus the variable cost per unit. And so that contribution is going to represent the portion of your sales revenue that's not consumed by the variable cost and is going to be used to cover all of your fixed costs. Now let's talk a minute about, the usefulness of the break-even analysis. So let me give you, again, kind of a better example of a break-even analysis, just using kind of a simple example. Now my mother-in-law likes to go to Vegas every year. And if she ends up winning more than she spent on all of her expenses to travel and stay and play while she's in Vegas, then she's made a profit. And we like it when Grams makes a profit because whenever she comes back from Vegas, she usually shares her winnings with us whenever she gets back. But the last time that she went to Vegas, she did not win money. Well, she won some money, but she only won enough to cover the cost for going on the trip. So in other words, she broke even. She didn't lose any money, but she really didn't make any money either. So there again, just trying to convey the message of exactly what break even is. And as an entrepreneur, it's really great to know that you can make enough money to cover your expenses. But let's face it, you're not taking this risk and challenge, just simply to cover expenses. You're doing this because you want to make enough money to support your family, take vacations, and hopefully one of these days be able to retire in comfort. So how is break-even analysis useful? Well, first and foremost, for the person that hasn't taken the leap into actually buying or starting a business, the break-even analysis is really going to help you to determine if the business is even viable, because it helps you to determine how much your small business must sell in order to cover all the expenses, and at what point you should expect to start making a profit. I'll give you an example. Several years ago, I had a client that came into my office that wanted to open a cherry berry franchise. Now, I don't know if in your area of the country, if you've heard of this particular franchise. It kind of started here in the Midwest. But she wanted to start a cherry berry franchise, and after doing a break-even analysis, found that she would have to sell on average 300 cups of yogurt per day, every day of the year. And now you have to understand that the community that she was wanting to start this in was a very small community, I would say, probably a population of around 10,000 people. And then, of course, here in the Midwest, in Oklahoma, we definitely have some major seasons. So, summer's not quite that long, about 4 months, and then we start in the fall and winter months. So, I had to sit and talk to this about her, like, do you really think that you can sell 300 cups of yogurt every day of the year? And so she was able to determine, that's really not feasible, at least not in the small town that she lived in. So that simple step of doing that gave her a very realistic insight that maybe that was not the best business model for her to get into. So, the point is that every business is going to have a break-even point. And break-even determines how much you need to sell on a daily, monthly, or annual basis. And so by doing a break-even analysis, you're able to answer questions like, am I selling enough to cover my basic cost? Or do I need to raise my prices? Or should I find ways to reduce my expenses? Now, it's important to understand what the results of your break-even analysis is telling you. So, for example, if the break-even analysis reports that you would break even when you sold your 500th unit, decide whether this is really feasible or not for you. And if you don't think that you can sell 500 units, which within the time period that you're analyzing, then maybe this isn't the right business for you to go into. Now, if you think 500 units may be possible but would be difficult, one thing that you can do is go back and try making some adjustments. So see if you can lower things like your price or reducing some expenses that you can live without, and then recalculate for a new break-even point. So that's the great thing about this, is that using the break-even analysis, you can see how you might be able to make some adjustments to make the business a little bit more viable. So, remember this too. If your break-even analysis is too high, so like I mentioned, take a look at your costs, both fixed and variable. Remember, fixed expenses are those that we have to pay regardless of how much we sell, and the variable expenses are those that go up or down depending on whether we're making more product or not. So go back and look at your fixed and variable expenses and identify those areas where you might be able to make cuts. So, another important thing here is to remember, not to give up on your dream. So if your break-even analysis comes back and you're like, that's not doable, try to look for some workarounds like, reducing certain expenses, because you just might need to make some adjustments to your original plans and perhaps even start out on a smaller scale. And, this existing business owners, I think I kind of mentioned that it's useful for them too. They can also equally benefit from using this because it's a tool that can help you answer the same questions, which is going to be important for regular financial management of the business, and as a feasibility tool in the event that you decide that you need to expand. So let's say you have a coffee shop that you've been running and it's doing really well and you want to expand to a second location. Doing a break-even analysis is going to help you determine if that's really a good idea or not. So now let's talk about the limitations of the break-even analysis. So I definitely don't want to downplay the usefulness of it, but it's also important for you to be aware of some of the limitations and be able to understand that for the purpose of this webinar, I'm keeping these examples pretty simple. Because my goal today really is just to lay that foundation for you to learn and build upon. So, one of the limitations of a break-even analysis is that it only tells you what you need to sell. It doesn't give you any actual idea of what you will sell. So it's not a crystal ball. So you can't do this and go, okay, well, this is how much I'm going to end up selling per month. It's just telling you what you're going to need to sell. Another limitation is in regards to fixed costs. Fixed costs are typically treated as costs that don't change, that they stay pretty permanent. And this is true at least in the short term, but over time, fixed costs often and do change. For instance, an example of this, I think I said rent was an example of a fixed cost. So, let's say you sign a 1-year lease and your rent is $1,500 a month. When you're doing your break-even analysis, that amount is not going to change. But however, at some point in the future, there could be an increase in the rent that you're paying. So any fixed cost like that, it's fixed in the short term, but over the long term, it can fluctuate some. And another limitation of break-even is associated with variable cost, because it assumes that the variable cost of each unit or product produced is going to be constant. And so for the most part, this is true, but understand that variable costs, so remember, think back to our hamburger buns and patties, our variable cost per unit may differ in the long run due to a number of factors. Some I can think off the top of my head is, maybe in the restaurant business, if your cook makes too many mistakes and has to throw a lot of food in the trash. So that's waste. Or there may be unexpected changes in the economy or the weather, and that can also increase maybe the amount that you spend on the goods to make your products. And, of course, I always reference restaurant stuff because that's the type of business that I used to have, so it's easy for me to give examples to that. But, like, I remember one time, we had a severe drought, and the cost of lettuce for a case of lettuce rose by $20. It was absolutely, we used a lot of lettuce. So that's just an example of, about variable costs and how they can change as frequently as they do. Now, another one of the limitations is that the break-even analysis that I'm showing you assumes that the number of goods produced is equal to the number of goods sold. So in other words, it is assuming that everything that you made was sold and that there's nothing left over in inventory. For some people, like let's say you're an artist and you only do custom orders, you don't really have to worry about having any excess inventory. But if you own a business like a coffee shop, then you're going to have some inventory on hand at all times. And so that's one of the things that this even analysis that I'm showing you doesn't really take into account for. Still very useful, though. Like I said, this is just kind of break-even analysis 101, and I just want to give you a basic foundation understanding. So there's some information that you're going to need whenever you start to do your break-even analysis. One piece of information is going to be your selling price. So you already need to know how much that you're going to sell that item or that service for. And you're also going to need to be able to determine what your variable cost per unit are. So again, back to the hamburger. Your variable cost per unit, we have to think about that hamburger bun and the patty and the lettuce and the tomato and every other thing else that we're going to have to use to create that product. And you also need to determine what your fixed costs are. So again, fixed costs, are things like rent, or if you have internet service for your business, that's going to be a fixed cost. Cell phones may be another one of those things that are going to be considered a fixed cost. And here's probably the most important thing to remember, or your break-even analysis is going to get really skewed. You have to determine the time frame that you're doing the break-even analysis for and adjust everything for that time frame. So if you want to do a break-even analysis for 1 month, then that means you need to figure out what your fixed costs are per month, your variable costs per month. So remember, all of those things have to use the same time frame. So I think one of a good way to examine this a little bit deeper is to kind of do a case study of sorts. So here I want to introduce you to Mike. Mike is a native business owner that blends and sells a variety of teas, many of which are blended with healing herbs and spices that are traditionally used by tribes in the Northern Plains. And I started selling his teas at local events and eventually started selling his products online. And he's been doing so well that he decided he wants to open a retail store. And he wants to do this because there's a lot of local tourists coming through visiting, the Nevada Great Basin area. And so he's wanting to capture the market from all of those tourists coming to visit. So to help him ensure that opening an actual retail location is feasible, he's going to use a break-even analysis. And so remember the steps we just talked about. So the first steps that he takes is to figure out his variable and fixed costs. So he figures out his variable and fixed costs so he can determine how much it actually costs him to produce one bag of tea. And this is his variable cost per unit, which includes the raw materials that he needs to create the teas and the wage that he pays an assistant to help him with filling orders. Now remember, variable costs fluctuate according to how much is produced. So the more tea that Mike sells, the higher his variable costs are going to be. So next, he looks at his fixed costs, and his fixed costs consist of things like rent and internet service, because remember, he's also got an online store, so he's selling his tea through places like Etsy and Amazon. And these are costs that he's going to have to pay whether he sells one bag of tea or 100 bags of tea. Okay, so now we're ready for the next step. And so that is to calculate our gross profit per unit. And I think in the definitions, I actually called it the contribution margin. So this is exactly the same thing. So here's our formulas that I put at the top of the screen for you, and it's the sales price per unit minus the cost of goods sold per unit. Remember, that's the variable cost, and that's going to give us our gross profit margin per unit. So Mike sells each bag of tea for $15, so there's our selling price per unit, and estimates that it costs on average about $4.60 to make each bag. That's our variable cost. So therefore, his gross profit margin per unit is $10.40. And this is the amount that he's going to use to cover his fixed cost and his other operating expenses. So now he has all the information that he needs to calculate the break-even point. So in this example, Mike wants to calculate the number of bags of tea that he needs to sell in order to break even. So at the top of the slide, I have carried over the basic equation for calculating your gross profit margin, and then followed that by the formula for calculating the break-even number in units. Remember, units is the number of bags of tea he needs to sell. So now Mike is going to plug all of his numbers into the equation. He takes his fixed cost of $1,175. Remember, that included the rent and the internet and a couple of other things. Oh, yes, his assistant. And he divides this by his gross profit margin per unit of $10.40. And so if you do the division, and remember, this is all simple math and break even. If you do the math, it's going to equal 112.9 units. Now, of course, Mike can't sell 9/10 of a unit, so he has to round it up a little bit just to make it an even 113 bags of tea. So in 1 month's time, he has to sell 113 bags of tea just to break even, not making a profit. And so if we were to equate this to sales in terms of dollars, we would take the 113 bags of tea, of course, and multiply by $15, because that's how much he sells each bag for. And so that is going to equate to sales of $1,695. So in order for Mike to break even for the month, he has to sell 113 bags of tea at $15, which is going to equal $1,695. Now, you remember me talking at the very beginning that, nobody takes a risk to start a small business in order just to break even. I mean, the goal of any business is going to be to make a profit, because you need to be able to live and pay your bills and take care of your family and plan for retirement. So I want to teach you how to do a break-even analysis that includes a profit. Let's say that Mike decides, I've got to make at least $3,000 a month from this business that I can take home and pay rent and bills and take care of my family. So here's how we do it. You take your fixed expenses, which was the $1,175, and you're going to add your desired profit to it. So Mike wants to make $3,000 a month, so he's going to add that amount to his fixed expenses. So that's a really very important thing for you to understand, that if you're calculating for desired profit, that has to be added and included as a fixed expense. So now we have a new number. So now his total fixed expenses is $4,175. And now we simply, to get the number of units and sales that he needs to break even, we do the exact thing that we just did, only now we have our new fixed expense cost with his salary added to it. So now his total fixed expenses is $4,175, and we divide that by our gross profit margin of $10.40, and that shows us that he now needs to sell 401 bags of tea. So that's quite a big difference from the way we calculated it a minute ago. So, but he has to earn money and pay himself. So now he has a new break-even point. Now, if we take the 401 bags of tea, I just rounded because we can't sell partial bags, and we multiply that by the selling price per bag of $15, now you can see that he, in the terms of sales dollars, he would break even at $6,015. I don't want to confuse anyone here, but I really stressed that desired profit had to be added to fixed expenses, because a lot of times what people will do is they'll do the break-even analysis, and once they have their final number, so I'm just going to step back here a second, get to the other slide. So they will actually take it and add it to their previous sales. Sorry, I kind of lost my place there, but I hope that makes sense. That always remember you have to add the desired profit to your fixed expenses and then redo your calculations all over again. Otherwise, it will come up majorly wrong. So, okay, anyway, based on Mike's break-even analysis, he feels very confident that he's going to be able to sell enough of his product that he can afford that physical retail location and still be able to make enough income to support his family. So that was a simple little case study that shows exactly how a break-even analysis works, and as you can see, how useful it can be to you. So now I'm going to ask you to grab a pen and paper. So I'll just pause a minute. Of course, you can always, since you're going to be watching a recording, you can always rewind here, but I just have a couple sample problems that I wanted to take you through. So if you can grab something to write on, calculator, your smartphone has a calculator on it. It may help you to actually work through these problems with this. So here's our first sample problem. So let's say you own a business selling burgers, and it costs you $2 to make one burger. That is going to be your variable cost. Now you sell each burger for $5.50. So remember, that's your sales price per unit. Now, remember, step one, we have to figure out what our gross profit margin per unit is. So we take the sales price, right? and our sales price is $5, and we subtract our variable cost per unit, which was $2, and that's going to give us our gross profit per unit. So if you're working that out and haven't got to it yet, you may want to pause because I'm going to switch slides and show you what the answer is. And there we go. So our profit margin per unit is $3.50. So we had our selling price of $5.50 minus our variable cost of $2, and that gives us a gross profit of $3.50. Now let's take this just a little step further here. So now let's think about how many burgers do you need to sell in a month to break even. So our selling price is $5.50. We have our variable cost of $2, and we have fixed cost expenses of $10,000 a month. So in order to do this, remember we take our fixed cost, we divide it by our gross profit margin, and that's going to equal the total of units that we need to break even. So there again, there's your formula right there. You take your fixed cost, divide by your gross profit, and that's going to give you your units to break even. So again, if you're still working that problem out, you may want to pause at the moment. So I'm going to go ahead and flip over here to the slide that has the answer. And the answer is 2,857 burgers. So that's how many burgers that you would need to sell in a month just to break even. Remember, that's not making any profit. And I'm going to take this just even a step further. This is what I love about the break-even analysis. You can just keep breaking it down and breaking it down into so many different ways. Okay, so here we are. We're kind of back to the example that we used with Mike where he needed to make $3,000 a month in profit. So remember what we have to do here. We have to take our fixed cost, which in this case is $10,000 a month, and we have to add our desired profit. And so our desired profit that we want to take home every month is $3,000. So we add those two together. And then we continue like before. We divide by the gross profit per unit, and that's going to give us the total number of hamburgers that we need to sell per month in order to break even. And so here we go. Here's the solution. Our fixed cost plus our desired profit divided by gross profit gives us a new break-even of 3,714 burgers that we'll have to sell every month in order to break even. Okay, let's just, for giggles, break this down again. Again, I love it because you can keep breaking the break-even analysis down into smaller and smaller time periods, which can often give you a more realistic view of whether this is feasible to do or not. So now let's do another problem. So let's think about how many burgers we have to sell on average per day, assuming that you're only open 5 days a week. And for simplicity's sake, let's just assume that it's a 4-week month. So in other words, during the month, we only have 20 days that we're going to be open selling burgers. So now let's calculate how many burgers that we need to sell per hour, assuming that you're open 5 days a week and open for 4 hours each day. So remember, we have our selling price of $5.50, our variable cost of $2, and we're back to our original fixed cost of $10,000 a month. This does not have our desired profit included. And we have our gross profit margin of $3.50 and our break-even point per month at $28.57. So let me just flip back over here. So we actually determined that we have to sell 143 burgers per day. So that's quite a bit. And if you want to go ahead and break that down further into hours, remember we're only open 4 hours a day. That's 36 burgers an hour. rewatch this DVD because I'm sure that was probably a little confusing, especially if you're kind of like me and you get a little freaked out when you first see numbers. But again, even though this is math, it's very simple math. And as long as whenever you're doing these, if you need to, make sure and write that formula out, and then all you have to do is plug the specific numbers into your right formula. So it's actually really super easy. Now, if anyone has any questions about this presentation, if you are trying to do a break-even analysis and you need some help and you don't understand, I encourage you to go ahead and reach out to me. I'm happy to help anyone. And so my contact information is there at the top. And my personal email address is lynn@lynnwilson.me. So again, if you're watching this and you have questions or you need help actually doing your own break-even analysis, you're welcome to contact me.